Well, hey, leaders, and welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carey Newhoff here, and I'm so excited to be with you again today. We're kind of doing a deep dive into a subject that I know is close to a lot of your hearts. We've been through the most traumatic year of your leadership, and you have led your church through the most traumatic year of your collective leadership as well. That's a pretty safe guess, I would say. Wouldn't you say, Brooke? Brooke Hempel is here with us from Barna today. Man, it's as a friend of mine wrote to me at the end of 2020. It's been a year. It's been a year, hasn't it?
Yeah. We've even heard from pastors some of their stories of their own challenges, just emotionally and with trauma of serving a traumatized population and how hard that's been on them, the toll it's taken on their families and their own lives and their health.
Yeah. So we have a number of interviews set up for that. We have Dr. Anita Phillips, who we're very excited to have in a few minutes today, but we're also going to be talking to Julie Wilson and Kayla Steckline and also Pete Scazzaro. So we're going to do a deep dive into this. And hopefully at the end of these episodes this month, you and the people you lead will be a little bit healthier, or at least you'll understand what's going on. So Barna's also done some research into that. So what do you have for us today, Brooke, when it comes to mental health and leadership?
Yeah, I thought we'd start with some stats that are kind of, I won't even call it post-COVID, but at least
right.
2021.
Yeah, okay. Moment-ish stats.
I know,
stats.
right?
Okay.
Yeah. These are from early this year, in February. So we did a quick survey of people's kind of overall health, their mental, physical, and emotional health. And we found in that about just over half, 56% of American adults rated their mental health an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10, meaning they feel pretty good about their mental health. But that means that 44% are rating it not as good. Now, not everyone is at the bottom of that ranking, but it also does show us that somebody's having some struggles in there, right? So 44% of American adults have had some sort of struggle with their mental health. And remember, this is subjective, like they're reporting this. So,
yeah, it's self-reported. It's not like a doctor said, oh, you have challenges, right?
Right. And so this is just what they're experiencing. So it actually may be higher in some cases that they're not recognizing symptoms. And then there are others that may just be an emotional response that's temporary.
Right.
But nevertheless, that's a pretty significant portion of the population. But what's really interesting is where we see numbers that are higher. So we saw a few things that contributed to a person rating their mental health as more of an issue or concern. So the younger they were, the lower they are to rate their mental health. So we also saw this in our Gen Z study, which I'll talk about in a minute too. It's probably a factor of this generation just being more aware of and more comfortable discussing mental health. And also partly like this is kind of the first major traumatic experience they're having in their lives for many of them, you know. So age is one factor. Gender, women are more likely to self-report these struggles than men, which might just be acknowledgement. Socioeconomic, that's a huge factor, especially this year, right? Because people who had a low income,
so what do we learn there?
Yeah, less safety net, less access to healthcare. All these factors can make your mental health more of a challenge to take care of, or can put you at risk in a variety of ways.
So lower socioeconomic levels reported a higher level of mental health challenges.
Health issues. Yeah, exactly. And actually, Dr. Anita can probably help you unpack that a little bit too, because there are so many different factors that play into that that I think would be great for you all to discuss. And then and physical health. So when one's health is physically poor, then it also has an effect on one's mental health overall.
That's interesting. So the older you are, the less likely you are to present that. Some of that goes to self-awareness too, right? Absolutely. And generational comfort in saying, hey, I'm not okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Our old generation right now is very reluctant to say, I have an issue. They will muscle through it. That's just their
That's right. That's right. I don't have an issue. You have an issue. So
yeah. But encouragingly, people who either consider themselves Christian or attend church are more likely to rate their mental health better, their mental and emotional health. So that's good. That suggests that spiritual nature really helps our mental health as well.
It's not that far off from that stat that we've talked about before on the show, and I've written about that David and I have talked about, David Kinnaman and I, that 29% of pastors said they seriously thought about quitting ministry last year. Do you see a connection between those two?
Yeah, I mean, so, these stats are from the general population, but we actually did do a pastor survey as well and found something very similar. Many of them had already said I had to take a break. But yeah, it's this year's been so trying, and it's very tightly tied.
Right.
That sense of burnout is real, and I think people just are at a break.
So what did you find in the pastor poll when it came to mental health? A big variance, or pretty much mirrored the population?
It was relatively similar, but honestly, I trust the self-report from pastors even more, because they're actually dealing with trauma.
More sensitive to it.
Yeah, well, and they're just we know what their circumstances are, right? So one of the things I was going to share actually was from our trauma in America report. We had found that the number one cause of self-reported trauma was the death of a loved one. And so people who had experienced trauma, 4 out of 10 of them said it was because someone had died in a way that has traumatized them. So pastors have been on the receiving end of all that. And so they, by even secondary effects, if they didn't know the person, or primary effects, if they did know this person, they are receiving all of this trauma all the time, because they're pastoring people who've lost loved ones. They're pastoring people who are going through trials. So they have their own challenges, and then they have everyone else's challenges that get layered onto them. That's a lot.
Well, that's a lot of insight. Anything else you want to share before we invite Dr. Phillips in?
Yeah, the last one I wanted to mention is that, I said Gen Z is more likely to self-report trauma. And one thing in particular that stood out was we asked about a number of types of trauma in that particular study that came out earlier this year. But we did find that 1/3 of Black teens and young adults and 1/4 of Latino teens and young adults reported experiencing racial discrimination that they said was traumatic. So it was a little lower in Asian Americans, more like 1 out of 7. But that might be something that's on the rise. But this is something that they're very attuned to and aware of, and it's really impacting their lives. And so I think Dr. Anita is really focused on that, has done a lot of research on that, and may have some good insights on what do we do with our young people especially, but really anyone who's experiencing that sort of racial trauma that comes with this moment as well.
Yeah. So if people want more, and I know there will be people who want more, they can go to barnaaccess.com, and everything we talked about and a lot more is in there, right?
Right. Yes.
Brooke, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. And so excited to have Dr. Anita Phillips with us today. She is a trauma therapist and a life coach whose work focuses on the intersection of mental health, spirituality, and culture. She is co-pastor at Kingdom Life Church in Baltimore, alongside her husband, Michael, and is the host of her own podcast, In the Light. Welcome, Anita. Good to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we shared a lot of data there in the introduction, but any initial comments or thoughts about that as you heard Brooke share from what Barna's learning?
I super appreciate the broad amount of research that Barna does, because it confirms what we know on the ground. And mental health professionals, ministers living on these front lines is exactly what we're seeing. And it's a very difficult time for people. And I have a lot of concerns, because mental health issues are sure to be the enduring legacy of COVID. Long after we've defeated this physically, people are breaking in ways that are not quick fixes. And so we are really going to need to keep our finger on this.
Yeah. And do you think we have felt the full impact of the trauma yet? Rick Warren was on the show, and he said there's a tsunami of grief coming, because I think we're all looking at the reopening going, good, it's going to be amazing. But are we through it? The trauma part?
No, not at all. And the reason is because we're still being actively traumatized. We love to talk about how back in 2020, back in the pandemic, but it's not back. It started then. And we love as humans to try and block off periods of time. But the reality is that people are still getting sick. People are still losing people around the country. We see this incredible wave of deaths to COVID that's happening in India right now. That's absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know where this will be when it airs in a week or so, but India is off the charts.
Off the charts.
And now they're getting variants in the US from India and Canada. I don't know about the UK, but this stuff is global, right?
Yeah, it's a global issue. And so we're not out of it yet. And a lot of times you're not able to even assess the damage while the tornado is still raging. That would be like standing outside while the tornado is still tearing up houses, trying to assess the damage, trying to figure out what caused the tornado. You don't do that. You take shelter and you study it later. And really, the winds are still raging at varying speeds for people, depending on where they are in the world. And so the data you shared earlier, or that Brooke shared, are examples of the different wind speeds, right? So
Right.
it's tornadoes are still raging for people at lower socioeconomic levels who may be continuing to reel from the economic shutdown. Young people had their lives disrupted in a way that's very difficult at those developmental stages. It's kind of like a cake that's baking and there's a boom and the cake falls in the middle. You know, they were already still like in this developmental stage, and then they're dealing with death at an unprecedented level. And at that age, our mortality awareness is low, right? We're not thinking about death the way a 75-year-old
I talked to a
might be thinking
23-year-old
about it.
last night, and you know, we were talking about the vaccines. This was in Toronto. And he goes, yeah, I'm not getting one. I'm 23. I'm healthy. Nothing's ever going to happen to me. And I go home and a 13-year-old's dead from COVID, you know, like, but there's that weird disconnect between all this stuff is happening around me, but it's not happening to me, or I dodged a bullet. Can I drill down a little bit? Because this is interesting.
Please.
I'd love your take on the generational divide. I thought that was really interesting in what Brooke said, that the older you are, the less likely you are to self-report that you're experiencing trauma. What do you see in that?
Well, for one thing, these words are new to older generations.
Yeah. Like,
trauma,
I want to get there.
mental
Like,
health
what is
issues.
trauma, right? Like
Exactly.
a decade ago, we didn't talk about trauma other than you were in a car accident and you experienced some kind of trauma and your leg is healing or whatever. But that's a newish phrase. So, but let's talk about the demographics. So what, you know, whether it's mental health or like I've got some challenges or I'm not feeling great, why are younger people, or what do you see under that demographic divide?
Well, younger people are more willing to talk about mental health, and Gen Z in particular is the therapy generation for sure. Millennials are kind of that transitional period. They are encouraging people to talk about it. They're breaking away from the strictures of their parents that said, you don't need therapy, you just need to pray or just hang in there. And so millennials are transitioning, but Gen Z is all the way in with therapy and talking about mental health. And some of that has to do with schools increasing their conversations about mental health. But of course, social media and access, they just don't carry the same stigma. And so they're more willing to talk about it than any generation before. And so that may seem like they're over reporting, but not only do they have the awareness and the lack of stigma, but they have the language.
Okay, so here's something I want to run this theory by you. I have sensed, working with a lot of church leaders for years, but especially over the last year, that around COVID, there may have been some denial. In other words, this isn't a big deal. It's no big deal. I'm fine. Our church is fine. We're at 70% attendance, 90% attendance, 100% attendance. This thing's over. Meanwhile, you know, India's on fire and the world is hardly stable. Is that... like, what is underneath that? Are you picking up denial among leaders? What is underneath that?
Well, unfortunately, as human beings, we tend to be very self-focused as fallen people, right? And so that's not my experience among Black church leaders at all. And
Tell
so
me
I haven't had that experience in terms of my Black church leader peers as much. And I definitely have white peers who are very aware of what's happening, but there are certain segments of the communities that have been hit harder by COVID. And it's harder to say this is all over when you've been burying your members in succession. And so that brings that reality in a different way. And I think there's also cultural perspectives about what it means for the church to be the church. And so feeling like it was an imposition or an imposition on religious liberty to close versus feeling like this is a public health situation can alter how we see things. And so there's some differences demographically where that's concerned.
Okay,
you hasn't hit you. I'm sure I did. I'm good for that. That's
no, but you know why? Because I hadn't run that through a racial lens. It's my white friends who are minimizing it because my you know, friends, my African-American friends, Asian friends, they're not minimizing it. It's white leaders who are like, no big deal. Everything's fine. I got it together.
Sure. So initially, of course, there was the disparities in communities that were hit. So if we're in cities where people of color are overrepresented, or if we're in areas that are poorer, where people were dying more, that's a reality. The United States, if we're going to be just myopic for a moment, the United States is a huge country with incredibly varied regions and spaces. It's like a bunch of countries cobbled together almost. And so our experiences are so distinct regionally that it's hard to be in touch with the reality of what's happening from Montana to Miami. It doesn't even feel like the same world if that's where you live. And so while we talk about how big the world is because of social media and internet, the reality is that our social worlds still remain relatively small. It's the space that we interact with that creates our reality. And so for a long time, more rural areas were not having the problems with COVID because they were more isolated and the urban areas were. And so then who lives there? So it's not, it is a racial lens that I brought to it, but really what I'm bringing to it is a cultural lens. It's a worldview lens. It's how we apply meaning to our experiences. And so there are different forms, I don't want to say forms, but discipleship is shaped differently in different cultural spaces. And part of discipleship is how we see God, how we see the environment, how we see the role of government, how we interact with authority. And so my experience has been that amongst many of my white brothers and sisters spaces, there's an element of discipleship that prepares people to be in conflict with the world. The world is going to be against you. The church is going to be under siege. We're going to have to fight. We're going to have to war. Where my experience with discipleship around who God is and how we interact with the world in places of color are not like that. There's not this adversarial experience with the external environment. That's not racial in terms of melanin in skin. It's a belief difference. It's a worldview distinction. And we need to make sure that we're paying attention not only to what's happening to people because they're visibly different looking, but also how we interpret our experiences based on our community of belief. And our country is still so largely segregated in terms of geography, where people live, but also socially, that the belief systems, the worldviews that different groups hold have been maintained in these communities, even though we're living, quote unquote, side by side. And so my perspective is the safety of all people. As a Christian, we put the safety of all people first. And so we're going to look at public health information, but we also see our individual loved ones dying at a faster rate. Then us not being able to gather at church together doesn't feel like an assault on our faith. But if you've been discipled from a worldview that's always on the lookout for attacks on the people of God, and I'm not saying that the people of God are never attacked, but if that's central to the worldview, then the interpretation kind of zeroes in on how am I being restricted? And is my religious liberty being restricted? And then bouncing back against that. And that's very American, right? I mean, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. So we really have to pay attention to how the worldview that we bring with us to Christ shapes the way we interact with Christ and how we believe we're being affected and what we need to do as a result. Because as 1 Corinthians 12 said, we were all Gentiles carried away to these dumb idols before we met Christ. The problem is that white evangelical America in particular has a difficult time, in my opinion, grasping the worldview impact on how they interact with scripture and how they interpret faith. But we all bring a worldview to it. That's why we look so different in worship moments, right? You can see it in worship moments, whether it's how we sing or how we move, our average sermon topic. You want to talk about a good research piece right there? What are the general topics of sermons in churches from different racial and ethnic backgrounds? Because that will tell you something about what the worldview values the most as those leaders try to deliver to their people the questions that they're asking and the answers, and help them to create an experience in this world that their worldview says is optimal. We bring that to the Word of God. And until we recognize that, we're going to continue to be a body that's divided. I'm the ear, so I'm not of the body. You're the foot, so you're not of the body, because we're making our cultural doctrine the whole thing, and it's not.
So if I'm being really honest about what I've seen and observed over the last year, one of the other trends would be, you mentioned the collective good. I've seen some churches kind of rally to the cause, like how can we help our city? How can we help our community? I've seen others kind of hunker down, and it's almost like not in my backyard. Like our people are safe from COVID. Here I live in the country, those aren't particularly diverse congregations necessarily. And I'm as a white male myself, making a critique of that sort of community. And I have seen probably a selfishness gene, and I'll probably even in myself at times too, over the last year that has really shocked me. Have you seen that in the church where it's like, we're gonna ignore this. We're gonna focus down. Everybody I know is safe. Therefore, there is no issue. Any comment on that? Because you're a therapist.
Yeah, sure. So, and that's why I talk about worldview and belief systems, because it helps me to look at different groups through an equal lens.
Okay.
because we're all human beings and we all have a worldview. I think what I hear you articulating is the individualistic emphasis that we see in Western culture.
Yes.
Everyone's
Yep.
aware of that.
I think we
That
became
is,
less collectivist and more individualist over the last year. Feel free to
we
disagree.
always return to default mode under pressure. It's control alt delete.
Ah,
For those of us who are old enough to remember control alt delete, that reset
yeah. I
default
am.
mode. Yeah. That reset default mode is where we all go under pressure. That's why it's so important for us to be transformed and conform to the image of Christ, so that under pressure we won't we won't revert. But until Jesus comes, we're going to be working on something. And under pressure, we cling tightly to our most highly charged values. And individualism is a highly charged value in the United States and in Western European countries in general. And so the individual really took center. Am I being forced to wear a mask, not allowed to go where I want to go, not allowed to do what I want to do? And that feeling like a significant affront. And we also, in the church spaces in particular, but the United States in general, has a view of themselves as kind of separate. Like when we say global, we mean everywhere but here. We don't put ourselves in the global world as a partner. But particularly, I think this has been a challenge in, again, when I say discipleship, I'm talking about how people's spiritual lives are formed and how we view things when it comes to our spiritual lives. The beauty of much of the evangelical church has been mission work, right? That to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ everywhere. The challenge has been that it's been everywhere else while not developing relationships across lines here in the United States. And so paying attention to the problems right here in my backyard has just not been an emphasis, right? We can know what's going on in Rwanda, but have no idea what's going on in the nearest city because that's not where we live. And so there really, I think, needs to be a shift where my brother and sister right here in my area, if they're suffering, I need to rush to that, to aid that, and not just
I
the
have
people
heard
over the
that
ocean.
so much over the last year. Like we became hyper localized, right? So I'm not New York, I'm not California, I'm Texas, or I'm Montana, or I'm South Dakota, and therefore I don't have a problem. Which is just a really, like, I think part of this, because this is supposed to be about mental health and trauma. I can see a lot of these analyses could actually make you more upset. Like, if I'm really honest with myself, I got a bit of stuff to confess here, right?
Come on.
Like there's some stuff we need to take a really good look at. So let's talk about trauma. What do we mean by that? What is trauma? Because we've all at some extent gone through this collective trauma, and its impact has been varying depending on your situation.
Yeah, so we are experiencing a collective trauma, and it's really important for people to realize that. A trauma is any event. If you want to talk about it as an event, a traumatic event is an event that has the capacity to overwhelm people's ability to cope, to disrupt the systems upon which people depend, and to make groups of people in mass less safe. So that's what we're talking about as a collective trauma, not individual trauma, but to know that an event has the capacity to be a collective trauma. It'll be those elements that it overwhelms our ability to cope, and it disrupts the systems. And we've seen that happen. Our economic system was disrupted. Our healthcare system was overwhelmed. And so that element is available right now. We can all be traumatized by it individually. How we individually experience it, whether it overwhelms our individual capacity to cope, depends on some of the direct effects, but it also depends on who we identify with as a collective, right? So when we say a collective trauma, humanity was exposed, but different groups of we had different experiences. So we as the church, we as Black people, we as parents who had to homeschool, we, those who are grieving the loss of someone to COVID. So there are all these we's, and who our we is will say a lot about how we experience this moving forward. So just as individuals, it depends. Stress is the element of trauma. Stress is trauma's weapon. Stress is not an emotion. A lot of times we talk about, I feel stressed, as an emotion. But what it really is that the increase of external pressure begins to challenge my internal resources. And when that external pressure overwhelms my internal resources, we are moving into the trauma direction. So if you think of it on a continuum, challenging issue, trauma, it's stress is increasing as we move in the trauma direction, and how deeply I've been wounded and what my resources and capacity are to cope will indicate whether I end up in that kind of trauma space. And that can have a much longer lasting effect on us than just a challenge.
So we opened up a huge subject here that could actually be a 4-year graduate degree, 5-year graduate degree.
Okay. It was, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Thanks for doing the work for us. We appreciate it, Anita. But I want to bring it down really narrow for a moment, because you're talking to thousands of leaders who would say, yeah, okay, maybe I'm the white guy in the middle of rural America, but I feel traumatized. Maybe
Sure.
they're an African-American brother or sister, who was at almost ground zero of COVID in New York, or lived through some very, very tight restrictions, or are ministering to people and say, yeah, my reality has always been traumatized. This just added to it. When you're counseling people, leaders who are traumatized, where do they start? Because, they didn't even want to hear the beginning of our conversation, where it's like, oh, this may not be ending, right? Because we think, okay, the way through this is it's over. Okay, great. I'm going to go mow my lawn. Everything will go back to normal. Or I'll go, play with my kids in the park. Everything will be back to normal. And I've just heard that over and over thousands of times in the last year from leaders who are like, stop talking about the new normal. Stop talking about pivoting. Stop talking about, all that stuff. So what do you do if you're in that place where you're like, yep, I have a problem. I'm stressed out. I'm traumatized. I don't even know what to do.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I like to focus on when I first start looking at whether a person has been traumatized or the extent to which they've been traumatized is by checking to see how their belief systems have been impacted. Because a trauma will change the way that you view yourself, God, the world, other people, any combination of the above. And so with spiritual leaders, that's going to be one of my first questions. What spiritual questions have arisen for you as a result of this? Are you struggling in any space? We can be completely dedicated to living a godly life while having some questions that really feel like open wounds. And for many pastors, that happened last year because pastors have been leading in real time. Yeah. And that is a very new experience for many. I call it the Moses model, right? That's not how we're used to leading. We're used to having the opportunity to study, figure things out, get answers. Many times we're in leadership partially because of the many experiences that we've had, so we can draw on our own experience to help people feel like we can get to the other side. But pastors have been in a Moses position. Moses had no instructions. He had some instructions like go. Right?
Yeah.
Go.
Like, go stand at the sea and let's see if it parts.
And let's see what happens. Right. And so when Moses was sent to Egypt, he just didn't have a whole lot of direction about what was coming next. And he was experiencing the freeing of the Israelites in real time with them. He was getting information about the next plague a couple hours before it happened. He's standing at the edge of the Red Sea when he gets that instruction. And he was thirsty when they needed water in the desert. He was hungry when they needed manna in the desert. So having to seek God for people while you are under that pressure, that's so new for so many pastors, to be in the throes of the emotional difficulty of not knowing, to also be thirsty while the people are screaming for water. Some rocks were hit last year, to also be hungry and manna and wanting to maybe try to store up some extra because this daily bread thing feels overwhelming. And having your emotions seen by the people, maybe having some failures seen by the people, and not knowing how that we're going to turn this corner, that is a very new experience for most pastors. And it was deeply jarring.
Yeah. So naming that is so important. And yet you got 30% of the people listening to the show who statistically are like, I think I'm leaving ministry. Or they're at least that's a semi-regular thought in their head. And I'm sure that's pain relief, right? So, I mean, if you're the doctor, what do you prescribe? Is it like, take a vacation, take a pill? Like, what do you need to do? Go to bed early? Like, practically speaking, what would a leader listening to this who's identifying with everything we talked about, what would you say, here's a step you can take? What are a couple of things you would recommend?
Well, let me say this may not be the answer that anyone's expecting, but as a therapist, when someone walks into my office, it's not my job to decide how their story should end and try and lead them there. So I can't give you advice to tell that 29% of pastors that you shouldn't leave or that you should leave. That's not what I'm here to do, because some of them may be moving into a different part of their life. And sometimes God uses disruption to move us when
But
we
I'm
wouldn't
talking
move.
about stress release, because I
Okay.
agree. Let's say they quit.
Mm-hmm.
The trauma didn't go away, right?
Right.
They started a store and they're a barista. They're
Mm-hmm.
still traumatized, or they start their
Gotcha.
own company. Oh, good luck with that, right?
Right.
So
Right.
so what do you do, like, just to say, I got to get out, because the world isn't going to get simpler. I got to get
Mm-hmm.
out of the crazy. How do I get out of the crazy?
I think the first thing with a trauma is to always be honest about how you're being affected. So often we haven't slowed down to actually admit it. What kind of pain am I in? What questions did this bring? What are the specific issues that are overwhelming you? Not that are overwhelming people, but that are overwhelming you. For some people, for some pastors, it may be the pain of members leaving or battling against them in this difficult time when they took a stand on an issue one way or the other. And so there may be a deep sense of betrayal. For other pastors, there may be a shaking of their faith in terms of some of the people who died. That was really a lot for some leaders, because we do tend to have a fundamental kind of belief that God protects us and covers people who really truly live for him. And so some of these COVID deaths were just so blindsiding. Like, this person, people lost pillars of their congregation, people who they depended on and who kept them, kind of having a sense of safety and function. So is that pastor grieving, and is that what's moving them? Is it that they were struggling as leaders going into this, and they had some misgivings going into this, and this just increased the pressure to make them be more in connection with their questions about whether they should be leading? So my first thing is, say what it is for you.
Grieve your
Really
losses.
sit down.
Name it.
Yeah, really sit down and name it. And then always we have to find a safe space to begin to process it. So I hope that pastors will feel safe enough to open up to a mentor or another leader who may also be struggling, someone that they're in relationship with. And we know many pastors struggle with having close friendships, and that's a whole other question. But hopefully there are people that they can safely articulate what the issue actually is. And then I'm going to always recommend counseling. I think it's really important for pastors, especially, to have a safe place where they can say anything. And that counselor can be a Christian, but sometimes it actually helps pastors to go to a counselor who's not a Christian, because they're not there to defend their faith and feel like I'm mislead. This Christian is going to have her faith lessened for listening to me talk about my problems. And a lot of times also a therapist who's not a Christian, but is compassionate because of the work that they do, can help you get to your actual issues emotionally and mentally as a person, not a title, just a person. And when we're trying to explain everything through spiritual language, sometimes we actually use that to get away from what we really need to be talking about and looking at. A lot of times it can help to sit with someone who's just looking at you, just you.
If I can just vouch for that advice for leaders listening who kind of prefer, something practical, like get a good night's sleep or whatever, that your advice reminds me very much. It took me back 15, 16 years to when I went through a period of burnout without a pandemic. And it was all of that. It was naming the losses. It was becoming honest with who I really was. It was going to a counselor, asking for help, leaning into community, all of those things. And that's really messy, and it doesn't get fixed in 10 minutes. It was more like a year or two of really deep soul surgery. But on the other side, 15 years later, I'm so much healthier. And I think that's really, really capable advice. I was just reading this morning, Anita, and I may have the number wrong. Somebody will correct me online, I'm sure, if I got this wrong, but I think 500,000 Americans are now dead because of COVID. And if you had gone back to 2018 and said, hey, in 12 months between 2020 and 2021, 500,000 Americans are going to be wiped out, you wouldn't have slept at night. And 100 years from now, I have a degree in history. Looking back on it, our great grandchildren will look at that and go, 500,000 Americans died in 12 months. Like, can you imagine? And we just kind of live through it. Are we numb to that? Like, what is going on?
Like I said earlier, it's sometimes hard to get your finger on the damage when the storm is still raging. History does clarify things for us. And we're actually getting close to 600,000 people now. I think today was up to about 570,000 at the day we were recording this. And for each person, anytime someone dies, there's on average 5 people who are acutely grieving, as I mentioned earlier. And so we're talking about I don't know, close to 3 million people who are acutely grieving loss. They're just in that space right now. So the big picture of all of this, we haven't had a chance to get our hands on it yet, just because the storm is still raging. But this kind of grief is traumatic, because while death is natural and it's a part of all of our lives, when someone dies from something that you never saw coming, I mean, a car accident, cancer, like these are all in the realm of experience for us as human beings, but a disease that no one ever heard of that came flying out of nowhere and took my loved one suddenly, that is traumatizing in itself, because it
Yeah, no
changes my
funeral,
no funeral. I can't grieve with other people. We haven't been able to touch. And as the world opens up, it's going to increase, because the reality of this person's absence for some people is going to increase. The first time I'm in church without them, you know, this real honest space that they're missing. And so we are not yet able to grasp that completely as a nation, I think, but we will in years to come. As you said, it's unimaginable. But I do think it's important to slow down and think about it.
So we're coming up on time, but I want to bounce
Yeah.
a story off you. When I was a young pastor, this is years ago, I was in my early 30s. Churches were still really, really small. And there was one guy I used to go visit back when you could visit in a small church. And and it's a sad story, but he had lost his son decades earlier, like in the 70s. And they went out canoeing. They were probably partying one night or something, and the canoe never came back. And he was just devastated by it. And they were waiting for the body to show up, and the body never turned up. So decades later, I show up as a young pastor, doesn't know what to do. And after hearing this story a few times, I just said, why don't we do a funeral? And so we did that. We did a service in a little church, and we remembered the boys who died, the teenagers who died. And it was tremendously healing for them, because they didn't have closure for those decades. Now, I don't know whether I did it right. I didn't know what I was doing, you know, but it really seemed to help. Do you think we're going to have moments like that in the future, where we couldn't grieve properly in this season and we need to learn to grieve in the future?
I hope so. I hope so.
Is there healing in that? Like, break that up. You got the training. I didn't know what I was doing. I still don't know, but
absolutely. It sounds like you knew exactly what you were doing. There's no playbook
I was
for
guessing.
it. But you were led by heart, and you understood the connection and relationship, and that sometimes we have to touch pain to release pain. And we live in a culture that doesn't like to do that. Even when there's not a pandemic, we're bad at grieving as a culture. We're like, move forward, get over it, let's
I'm
go.
fine.
Right.
Funerals yesterday. Leave me alone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so people can become incredibly isolated, incredibly lonely, more vulnerable to depression, anxiety, because they are not able to connect with other people around their experience. And so I hope that churches in particular, but anyone and everyone, will invite communities of mourning in the months and years to come, that we will sit with people, that we will go to grave sites that we weren't able to go to because we were on virtual funerals, that we'll gather and hold hands and hug each other and cry. Those tears will not be released until they're released. They won't evaporate. They need to be shed. And so when you say that, I say, I hope so. The lament needs to happen. It's not giving up. It's not a lack of faith. It's about us coming together and taking good care of each other.
When you're grieving, when you're traumatized, how do you lead a whole congregation through all the trauma? And again, that's another 5-year graduate degree. I understand.
Yeah, I'll say it in one word though: vulnerably. Vulnerably. This is an opportunity for leaders to be vulnerable in the way they haven't before. This is how I'm feeling today. I'm standing here in front of you with this feeling. I want you to know that's human. I'm going to be honest. I'm vulnerable. I still believe this word that I'm about to preach to you. I'm going to preach it. But this is how I'm feeling. That kind of vulnerable leadership will be transformative in this era. And I encourage leaders to do it, even if they've never done it before.
You know, the other thing that's really risen up in me, and again, I feel like now we're in a therapy session. Okay.
That's okay.
Forgive me. But I've become more distrusting of spin in this last year. If you're trying to spin me, if you're trying to hype me, if you're trying to say, hey man, everything's great, welcome to church, I'm like, I want to turn you off. What is that?
Because your pain level is high. And when our pain level is high, what's the good Christian word for it? Our caca radar is high.
Yeah.
And people are wearing their needs right on their sleeve. It's right here. And so to have someone try and spin it or skip over it or rush through it, it feels like a rejection.
I'm like, talk to my soul. Be real.
Yeah,
Be
it
real.
feels like a rejection. Are you going to see me standing here hungry and just not feed me, not share with
Tell me
me?
to come to
And
your show. Yeah.
right, not right now. Not right now. There needs to be space to grieve and rejoice. We've been living at this intersection of grief and gratitude for months. So I'm grateful for what I do have, grateful I'm not sick, grateful I have a job, grateful, but also grieving underneath that. And this, we usually present it as this dichotomy, like, oh, if you'll just be grateful, you won't feel the grief. But we are living at an intersection where we have to be willing to hold the tension between the two. And I don't think there's anything more powerful that a leader could do right now than to model what it looks like to live in that tension.
All right. Well, I don't know what our original questions were, but this was a great conversation, Anita. Hey, I know people are going to want to track with you more, and I think you just helped thousands of leaders. So thank you with this. Where will people find you online? Tell us about your podcast, your books, etc.
Sure. So you can find me on all the social media platforms at Dr. Anita Phillips, Dr. Anita Phillips, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, although I don't tweet too much these days because Twitter's kind of a scary place for me. But I do have a profile there. You can also, if you want to get in touch with me, my website is anitaphillips.com. And I encourage you to please check out my podcast, In the Light with Dr. Anita Phillips. It's at the intersection of faith, mental health, and culture. And so we're always wrestling with these questions. And the fact that God had me start that podcast about a month before things got really bad, I've just been so grateful to be able to have this conversation during one of the hardest times in all of our lives. And so I invite people to join me in the light. God's really been meeting us there.
I think you opened up a lot of doors, and it may get a little bit darker before it gets brighter. But, you know, I've found in my own life, I can just vouch for what you were saying. Going into those places you don't want to go leads you into a much better tomorrow. So thank you so much. And hey, we do want to thank the people who partner with us on this podcast. Thank you so much to Metashare. You can go to metashare.com/ChurchPulse. And they also have, I think, counseling services and things like that too. So you'll save a bit of money. And also Subsplash. They provide mobile and TV apps, online giving, and a whole lot more at the Subsplash platform. You can visit subsplash.com/ChurchPulse to learn more. And thanks so much for watching and listening this week. We're back. We are focusing on mental health. And so we're going to get multiple different perspectives and voices on this. Thanks so much. And if this episode blessed you, share it with some friends and let us know on social as well. Catch you next time on Church Pulse Weekly.